Hey everyone, welcome back to HOA Karen Storie. I hope you're all doing well today. Imagine waking up to the peaceful sounds of nature, the soft rustling of trees, the chirping of birds, and the scent of fresh air. That's the life I thought I was getting when I moved to my grandfather's farm. I had inherited it after he passed away, just a small piece of land on the outskirts of town. But I couldn't have predicted the drama that would unfold the moment I set foot there. It all started with something as mundane as receiving a package. I had ordered a few tools and supplies to fix up the barn and start making the farm my own. It was a Tuesday morning when the package arrived. I stepped outside to grab it, and that's when I saw her. Linda, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. She was standing by her fence, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, as she observed me like a hawk. I thought nothing of it. I waved, thinking she was just curious about the new neighbor. But Linda wasn't the type to make casual small talk. "Excuse me," she called, as I bent down to pick up the box. I turned around, trying to be polite. "Yes?" "You're on private property," she said, her voice sharp. "You can't just walk around like that." I was taken aback. Private property? What was she talking about? I had just moved in, and this was my land. "Excuse me?" I said, trying to maintain my composure. "This is my property. I live here." Her eyes went wide with disbelief, and for a split second, I could see the gears turning in her mind. That's when I heard it, the sound of sirens. I thought it was a coincidence at first, but as the noise got louder, I realized it wasn't. Linda had actually called the cops on me. I stood there in complete shock, holding my package, as the cop car pulled up. And that was just the beginning of a nightmare I wasn't prepared for. The officer stepped out of the car, looking more confused than anything. He glanced at me, then at Linda, and then back at me. "Sir, we got a call about trespassing. Is there a problem here?" the officer asked. "Trespassing? On my own property?" I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. "Officer, this is my land," I explained. "I've just moved in. My name is your name. I'm the legal owner." The officer nodded, but didn't seem convinced. He looked at Linda for confirmation, and she was ready with her version of the story. "He's been walking around the yard, interfering with my property," Linda said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I don't know who he thinks he is, but he doesn't belong here." At this point, I could feel my patience running thin. I wanted to shout, to explain to her that I owned the place, but I kept my cool. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I have all the legal documents to prove that this is my property." The officer glanced at Linda again, then back at me. He wasn't sure who to trust, but he decided to check the deed. "Just a moment, sir," the officer said, stepping back to make a call. I could see Linda watching me, her face a mask of triumph. She thought she had won, but little did she know, the law was on my side. As I stood there waiting for the officer to make the call, Linda's attitude became even more hostile. She crossed her arms and gave me a look that could freeze anyone in their tracks. "Let's see if you can prove you belong here," she muttered, barely audible. The officer returned a few minutes later with a look of confusion on his face. "Well, sir, the deed is in your name. It looks like you're the legal owner of this property." I couldn't help but feel a surge of relief. But that didn't stop Linda from digging in her heels. "This is a mistake," she said. "I've lived here for years, and this land has always been part of our HOA. You can't just come here and take over." The officer looked between us, clearly unsure of how to proceed. I had the documents, the legal right to be there, but Linda wasn't going to back down that easily. "Ma'am," the officer said, "it looks like there's no reason for me to be here. The property belongs to this gentleman, and he has every right to be on it." But that wasn't the end of it. As the officer got back in his car, Linda gave me one last glare. "This isn't over," she hissed before storming off to her house. I thought that was the last of it, but boy, was I wrong. In the days that followed, Linda made sure to make my life miserable. Every time I stepped outside, she was watching from her window, her eyes trained on me like I was some kind of criminal. She started spreading rumors around the neighborhood, telling people that I was a fraud and didn't belong on the land. At first, I tried to ignore it. I was busy fixing up the farm, planting crops, and cleaning up the property. But soon, I started receiving complaints from the HOA about my infringements on the property. Every little thing I did was scrutinized. Apparently, I was violating neighborhood codes because I hadn't painted my barn a certain color, or because I hadn't trimmed the trees to the HOA's exact specifications. It felt like I was under constant surveillance, and it wasn't. Long before I realized that Linda was the one behind all of it. She had put the HOA up to the task of making my life difficult, and she was determined to run me out. Enough was enough. I wasn't going to let one person, especially someone like Linda, take away my family's land. I started looking into my legal options. I consulted a lawyer and began gathering evidence. It was clear that Linda and the HOA had overstepped their boundaries, and I was ready to take action. My lawyer advised me to start documenting everything, from the complaints to the harassment. I kept a log of every interaction with Linda, and every time she contacted the HOA. It wasn't long before we had enough evidence to take legal action. The next step was to send a cease and desist letter to Linda and the HOA. I wasn't going to let them bully me out of what was rightfully mine. The letter was sent, and the tension between Linda and me reached a boiling point. She wasn't expecting me to fight back, and now she was realizing just how wrong she had been, but she wasn't about to let it go. One afternoon, I found a letter from the HOA waiting for me at my doorstep. It was a formal warning. Apparently, they had decided to fine me for violating HOA codes. Codes I had never agreed to, mind you. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about Linda trying to assert her control over me, and she wasn't going to stop until I gave up. But that wasn't going to happen. At this point, I had no choice but to take the fight to court. The HOA's actions were becoming more and more aggressive. It was clear that they were trying to intimidate me into giving up. But I wasn't backing down. I hired a lawyer, and we started preparing for the legal battle ahead. We knew the HOA didn't have a leg to stand on, but they had the resources and were willing to make things difficult. The first thing we did was challenge the fines. The HOA was trying to charge me for violations that didn't even exist in the first place. And Linda. She had made it her mission to rally the neighbors against me, even though most of them knew I was the rightful owner. I'm not going to lie. There were times when I felt overwhelmed. The legal fees were mounting, the pressure was building, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was all worth it. But something inside me told me to keep going. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for my family's legacy, for my land, and for the right to live in peace. The more we dug into the HOA's activities, the more we uncovered. It turned out that Linda wasn't just some overzealous neighbor trying to protect her property. She had been involved in some shady dealings with the HOA board members. Apparently, they had been using their position to force neighbors into paying inflated fees and fines for minor infractions. It was clear that they were abusing their power, and I wasn't the only one who had suffered because of it. One of the neighbors, a quiet elderly woman named Mrs. Miller, approached me one day with a stack of documents. She told me she had been harassed by the HOA for years, all because she didn't fit into their perfect neighborhood mold. She handed me receipts, letters, and even photos that showed how the HOA had been taking advantage of residents for their own financial gain. This was bigger than I thought. The HOA wasn't just targeting me. They had been doing this to others for years. The court date finally arrived. The tension in the air was palpable as we all gathered in the courthouse. On one side, there was me, my lawyer, and a small group of supporters who had been following my case. On the other side, there was Linda, the HOA board members, and their expensive lawyer. I could see the smug look on Linda's face. She was confident, thinking she had everything under control. But as the proceedings began, things didn't go as she expected. My lawyer presented the evidence, and it was clear that Linda and the HOA were guilty of harassment, fraud, and abuse of power. One by one, the neighbors came forward to testify, including Mrs. Miller, who spoke about how the HOA had tried to force her into paying thousands of dollars for things that were completely unnecessary. It was shocking to hear how many people had suffered under the HOA's tyranny, and it became clear that Linda had been the mastermind behind it all. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally made his decision. I was awarded full ownership of the farm, without any fines or penalties from the HOA. Linda's actions were exposed, and she was removed from her position on the HOA board. But that wasn't the end of it. The court also ruled that the HOA had to pay back the money they had illegally fined residents over the years, and they were required to revise their bylaws to prevent further abuse of power. It was a hard-fought victory, but I had won. The feeling of relief was indescribable. I was able to go back to my farm, the place I had inherited and worked hard to make my own, without the constant threat of harassment hanging over me. As for Linda, well, she didn't take it well. The last time I saw her, she was packing up her things and moving out of the neighborhood. She had lost everything, and she had no one to blame but herself. Life slowly returned to normal after the court case. The farm that had been a source of so much stress and conflict had become a place of peace once again. I spent my days working the land, fixing up the barn, and even starting a small garden. The neighbors who had been too scared to stand up to the HOA started to speak to me again, and I made a point of welcoming them with open arms. The whole experience had taught me a valuable lesson. I had learned that standing up for what's right is never easy, but it's always worth it. And sometimes, when you least expect it, you might find that your biggest battle can lead to your greatest victory. I still look back on the whole ordeal and laugh. It's hard to believe it all started because Linda called the cops on me for walking on my own property. So, where do we go from here? Well, my life is back to normal now, but I'll never forget what I went through. I've learned that sometimes the biggest challenges can come from the most unexpected places, like a nosy neighbor and an overbearing HOA. But I also learned that you don't have to face those challenges alone. There's always support if you look for it. As for the farm, it's thriving. The crops are growing, the animals are happy, and the peace and quiet that I dreamed of when I first moved in are finally mine. I'm living the life I always wanted, and I couldn't be more grateful. And as for Linda and the HOA, well, they've learned that there are consequences when you try to mess with the wrong person. I may have been just one guy on a farm, but I stood my ground, and that's what really mattered in the end. So, to everyone out there facing their own battles, remember, don't let anyone take away what's yours. Whether it's your property, your rights, or your peace of mind, stand up for yourself. Because in the end, the truth always wins. Call to action, voiceover. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an exciting story. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or any similar experiences. You never know, your story might inspire someone else. Thanks for watching.